Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called The Human Disease, written by Grenadier42. The Winsel spat at the table of humans, causing a thick glob of viscous blue mucus to slap itself into the center of their table, sending vile tendrils out into the food of those seated. None of them made a move, save for one who gently put down their fork after part of the snot had landed on the bite that they were about to take. The Winsel muttered a series of curses in their own language, causing the translators to whine in protest as she bristled up her spines to show of aggression. Sister Anne, the one who had put down her fork, gently scraped the soiled food off onto another portion of her plate and continued eating. "Pay her no mind," she said calmly to the others seated around her. They nodded and each parceled out their food into spoiled and unspoiled before resuming their own meals. The Winsel cursed again. "What is she saying?" asked Brother Timothy as he gently adjusted to get more comfortable. The Winsel was standing directly across from him now as she began pacing around the table, trying to get a reaction out of those seated. Sister Anne paused, another bite halfway between her plate and her mouth, and cocked her head slightly to get a better understanding of the hissing, splattering, and growling that was emanating from their offender. "She's calling us barbarians," she finally said, and resumed eating. Brother Fidelis raised an eyebrow. "The translator struggled with barbarian." "No," Sister Anne said after she finished chewing her food, "but that is as close a translation as is possible." She put her fork down and turned to look at the Winsel, who stopped in a sudden attention that she had received, and gave her an appraising look. She then turned back around, her face still placid. A much more literal translation would be a word meaning filthy, dirt-eating, pus-licking, grave-robbing, naked, sun-worshipping bipeds, all at once. A smile then broke across her face, which really is just a much more colourful phrase for barbarian. "I didn't know you spoke Winselian," Sister Lucy said as she gently adjusted her headscarf to be more comfortable. Sister Anne smiled. "I speak a little," she said, "mostly enough to know when I'm being insulted, or," she winked, "to insult back." Everyone around the table chuckled quietly, causing the Winsel to begin shouting at them. Only this time, the translator did catch it. "What's so funny?" she shouted as she fidgeted with her hands, flicking her claws open and closed as she stared over the obviously offending party. "Do you not see that you are unwelcome?" "Yes, quite," said Sister Anne as she picked up a napkin and gently wiped her mouth. She then adjusted her own headscarf before turning to look at the Winsel, "though I doubt our money suffers from the same malady." The Winsel growled low as her eyes flicked over to the dining room to the other patrons, who all seemed desperate to keep out of the conflict. Only a few met the enraged Winsel's eyes, which only seemed to infuriate her further. "Don't worry, though," Sister Anne said, rising from the table and pushing her seat back. "We're all quite finished." She nodded to the rest of the party, who looked at each other, nodded in agreement, and rose to depart as well. She then dug around in her pockets, pulled out a data card and swiped it along the reader on the table. It beeped once to confirm payment, and Sister Anne smiled. "Acceptable in all regions, it seems." Her smile then turned mischievous as she made the sign of the cross before saying, "Go with God." The Winsel snarled and hissed another curse before taking a few steps back to give them room. She then made no effort to pursue the four as they walked out of the restaurant and into the main halls of the starport. From there they filed in behind Sister Anne, who led them through the crowds and hallways towards the docking bays in silence. Occasionally they would hear a jeer or a shout, sometimes a whoop in condescension, coming from the crowds. But aside from the Winsel in the restaurant, no one dared show their face. In fact, many gave them a wide berth, seemingly fearful to get too close. There were, however, different glances. A few did their own species version of a smile or a nod as they passed. Signs of respect passed from one species to another. These were few, but were appreciated all the same. "Sister Anne?" Brother Timothy finally asked as they got closer to the docks. "Yes, brother," Sister Anne responded without turning, her hands clasping in front of herself as she walked. "We do not normally question your judgment, but—" "Why did we leave so quickly after the Winsel showed up?" Sister Anne asked as they finally arrived at the docking station. She held out a hand towards the keypad to access the landing pad, but hesitated and withdrew it. She turned to face him. "Because we have been called to fulfill our promise," she smiled sadly. "I received the message from the church shortly after she began spewing her obscenities." "You mean?" Sister Lucy asked hesitantly. "Yes," Sister Anne said. "A lamb has been lost, and we have been asked to go and find it." Despite the noise and activity of the station, silence and calm seemed to radiate outwards from the four as they stood by the door to access their ship. None of them spoke, but a question seemed to hang in the air as everyone seemed to gather their thoughts. Sister Anne read the room and, maintaining her sad smile, shook her head. "No, we don't know what to expect. It was just a distress call, nothing more." After another moment's silence, Brother Fidelis said, "Then we better hurry," while looking at each other member in turn. "Agreed," said Brother Timothy. "Agreed," said Sister Lucy. Sister Anne nodded once in thanks. "I am sure that the Father is already warming the engine for us." She turned and quickly entered the combination into the keypad, and the door stood open to reveal a long, narrow walkway comprised of sleek, polished metal. The group quickly walked down the hallway towards another door and knocked gently 3 times. The door opened, and they were ushered in quickly into the ship. "What do we know?" asked Sister Anne as she quickly brushed past the sister that had opened the door for them. Already she could hear the whine of the engines. Good, she thought to herself. Father Philip did not waste time. "Vasim vessel," the sister responded, rushing to keep up and trailing just behind Sister Anne as they made their way to the bridge. "It was set to arrive at port 334AB-DJ approximately 2 standards ago. It was carrying crates of medical research supplies that are highly prized for their medical and explosive capabilities." She and Anne moved out of the way to let someone else pass. Then they both moved onto the bridge. "It has not responded to hails." "Region of space?" Sister Anne asked as she moved over to stand beside Father Philip, who was busy punching in coordinates and undocking requests. "Sector 411-45-984A, responded Father Philip. "Currently the region is suffering from some increased pirate activity, as well as various jump lane anomalies that are fortunately well documented." He turned to face Sister Anne and smiled. "Probably related. Glad to have you here, sister." "Glad to be here," said Sister Anne. "Time to destination?" Father Philip looked at the controls with furrowed brow. "A day and a half at best. I can push it a little more to get us there somewhat faster, but, as always," he looked back at Sister Anne, "we are probably the first responders." "As our Lord requests," Sister Anne said. "Make haste. I will prepare our brothers and sisters." Father Philip nodded and returned to the controls, and Sister Anne turned and left the bridge. She would hold Mass to help update the final requests tomorrow morning for those who would be going over to the other vessel. Unfortunately, as was frequently the case, there was no way to know how many would make it back. While the FRS St. Timothy was not the largest ship that the church deployed, it was one of the fastest. It specialized in search and rescue, seeking out the lost ships and vessels of the other assembly members by responding to calls for aid. A distress beacon, a last transmission, or even a direct request to the church would usually send the nearby clergymen scrambling to get their ship to fly off and render aid. There was suspicion and even outright hatred when they showed up to the less distressed vessels. They had been turned away many times due to the nature of the people piloting the vessel. A few times they had even been fired upon as a slew of insults ranging from vulture to plague ship were hurled at them through the airwaves. Still, they tried. It was what they had all chosen to do. Father Philip was only slightly off on his time calculation, though in a more desirable direction. They arrived a little before he had anticipated, and so Sister Anne had been forced to cut Mass short to allow the others time to prepare. She ordered a full level 6 workup, armor, environmental suits, and weapons. They refused to kill if they could help it, but not everyone gave them a choice. Arriving on the bridge, she looked out at the view screen to see the Vasim vessel, spinning lazily in the void, spewing metal and atmosphere off into the ever-increasing spiral. She looked over at Father Philip, who had his brow furrowed again. "What is it?" she asked. "It was right where they said it would be," he answered. "I programmed in a 3-day sweep to start searching the sector for the last known points, but..." He trailed off and weakly indicated the view screen. "There it is." "Ah," said Sister Anne, She furrowed her own brow, sighed, and shrugged. Duty calls. She headed towards the door, but paused, turning back towards Father Philip. Say a quick prayer to St. Michael for us, would you? Father Philip pursed his lips and nodded once. Thank you, she said quietly, and went below to gather those who would be going across the void to the other ship. Okay, everyone, listen up, Sister Anne said as she finished clipping on her combat boots. We are going to be doing the void jump across to another ship. We know that they were carrying medical supplies, and so we don't know what sort of environmental contagions they may be. Hence the void jump. Father Philip has gotten us close, and so it should be an easy leap. But be careful. She looked out across the other faces who would be joining her and said a quick prayer that they would come back. Once we are aboard, we will split into groups of 3 and start searching for survivors. She grabbed her helmet and began affixing it to her head. Once we have all the survivors on board and in medical, we can start going back to see if we can salvage any of their merchandise. Why the merchandise? Asked Sister Maria. Because this is their livelihood, Sister Anne said sternly before clasping her helmet down. She then held up her fingers in 3, 2, 1, and then yanked down on the door mechanism, causing the air dock to slide wide. The air shot out of the ship in a sudden burst, sending dust and other particulates flying out of the ship and into outer space. Various bits of clothing and harnessing fluttered in the sudden breeze and then died down. Sister Anne held up her fingers again and everyone leapt into the void towards the other ship. Fortunately, it was a really short jump. Father Philip was an excellent pilot and so had navigated them very close to the other ship, making it only a few seconds in the void before solid ground again. All 12 of the clergy arrived with little issue into the gaping hole on the side of the Vasim vessel. Once they had all touched down, they activated their boots and looked towards Sister Anne for directions. All right, Sister Anne said. There is still some residual power, it seems, so you shouldn't have too much trouble navigating. In that case, 1, 2, 3. You 3 head towards the engine room and see if you can find anyone out there. 1, 2, 3. You 3 head towards the storage hold and see if you can get ahead and find what they were carrying. 1, 2, 3. You 3 start searching the living quarters. Maybe someone is alive. You 2 come with me. We are heading to the bridge. Everyone nodded and began turning before Sister Anne shouted, Wait! Causing everyone to turn back. Shield bearers? She asked, and one of each group nodded. Be ready. There is a lot of pirate activity in this sector. They nodded again and turned to head off in that direction that they had been ordered. Sister Anne then motioned for the remaining 2 to follow, and they set off in search of the bridge. They wandered through a maze of hallways, trying to follow the signs that pointed towards the bridge. Wires, pipes, and other detritus were strewn about, speaking to the severity of the explosion that had crippled the ship. Sister Anne and her team maneuvered carefully through it, keeping their eyes open for any signs of life. The whole time they felt a deep sense of unease as they started to notice an increase in scorch marks, bright doors, and things that appeared intentionally vented. Before long, they had arrived at the bridge, and Sister Anne moved to open the door with Brother Timothy standing by with his shield when the doors suddenly opened, and a hunched-over Vasim in a spacesuit quickly ushered them inside. They stepped into the bridge, and he quickly closed the door behind them. He then turned to them and held up his fingers, counting out the code for the frequency the suit he was on. Once they were tuned in, they were quickly greeted by the wheezing, labored breathing of their newfound survivor, moments before he hunched over, grunting in pain. Sister Anne and Lucy rushed over to his side, but he waved them off. I am already dead, he whispered through his pain. He looked up at them. You need to leave. Sister Anne stood up and pinged the ship, and Father Philip's voice sounded in their heads. Yes. We found a survivor, Sister Anne said. Prepare the med bay. No! No! Shouted the Vasim as he reached out for Sister Anne's arm. He grasped it, causing her to turn to him in confusion. They are still here. The ball formed in the bottom of Sister Anne's stomach. Who? The Black Lance, the Vasim whispered. What? Sister Anne shouted as she grasped at the Vasim, who had already hunched back down in pain. Why are they here? The medicine, the Vasim said weakly. Hit us a few days ago. They were unloading it when someone fired a shot. He began to cough, and Sister Anne saw a small splutter of blood hit the inside of his helmet. blew their ship right into the black. He looked up at Sister Anne, a sad smile on his face. After they calmed down from their bloodlust, they decided to wait on the first responders. Said they knew you would come, needed me to send the message. I'm so sorry. Sister Anne saw and felt the point of plasma bolt whiz past her head. She whirled in surprise and only felt a moment's confusion when Sister Lucy remained stationary. The massive hole in her suit and the surprised look on her face quickly dispelled any confusion and instead told Sister Anne what she needed to know. The Black Lance had wanted to make this quick. Fortunately for her, Brother Timothy still had his shield. Crucifixion! Shouted Sister Anne into all frequencies before grabbing the seam and leaping over to stand behind Brother Timothy as more shots whizzed past her. He had deployed his shield, an enormous plasma screen that would absorb or deflect most weapons known to the assembly. It was tall enough and broad enough that several could easily stand behind it. She put her hand on Brother Timothy's shoulder as she got in position behind him. He nodded and then began moving out of the room, with him firing his own weapon around the side to give them some breathing space. They backed down the corridor with Brother Timothy guarding their rear, and Sister Anne sweeping them for more Black Lance to make sure that they were not walking into a trap. All the while, green bolts of plasma whirled down the corridors after them, many striking the shield, turning it a dull red as they struggled to dispel the fire. The Vasim squirmed and writhed as Sister Anne forcibly carried him with her, unwilling to let him go. Turning a corner, they were joined by another group, down one, and with combined shields they were able to quickly maneuver through the remainder of the ship to meet up with the rest of the group. I picked up some hitchhikers, said Father Philip, as the ship maneuvered even closer to the opening than previously. And, asked Sister Anne in confusion and fear, I offered to give them a testimonial and they said no, he said, as the ship settled in dangerously close to the opposing Vasim ship. Good, Sister Anne said, and leapt out into the void, her hand outstretched to grab onto one of the other clergymen who had already made the jump. Once stable, she turned around to assist the remnants of the teams doing the same while green lights flickered around them. The shield bearers did what they could to deflect the fire coming in, but a few still found their marks. Sister Anne pulled in those who made the jump and said quick prayers for those who did not. The second the last boot touched metal, Sister Anne slammed the emergency close button while shouting, "Jump!" and the ship ceased to exist in real space. Basim Sandrai opened his eyes to the white room and warm blanket over his body. He had expected to find himself dead, certain. Or perhaps this was death, and it was exceedingly dull, just like the inside of a medical bay. Ah, you're awake, said a voice, accompanied by the sound of a book closing to his left. He turned his head and saw a human, maybe a woman, clothed in a simple, floor-length outfit with a scarf wrapped around her head. She had piercing blue eyes and was staring down at him with what appeared to be sympathy. Where am I? He finally managed to say as he worked to moisten his dry mouth. Aboard the FRS St. Timothy and headed for the nearest starbase in your area of space, she said with a smile. I believe you call it furthest reach. From here, we plan to transfer you to a medical facility where you can await pickup by friends or relatives or whomever you wish to collect you. You're the one who saved my life, he said, gently nodding his head in gratitude. Sister Anne laughed. I suppose I did, in spite of your protests. I'm Sister Anne. Why? She stopped laughing and frowned. Your people call us plague bearers, I think. The spreaders of the human disease, religion. She looked down at him, her eyes still warm, yet now cautious. What answers would you like to hear? The truth, if you please, Sandry said with caution. He hoped the translators picked up on the nuance. Ah, Sister Anne said, not truth, but truth. Very well. She took a deep breath, held it for a moment and said, I assume you believe that we only do this because our gods command it. She cocked her head quizzically and paused, waiting to see if Sandry answered. But he didn't. She shrugged. Most do, after all. We're infected. Sandry frowned. You claim there is another reason? The church does not need holy crusaders or warriors for Christ or some other archaic convert the barbarians nonsense like many choose to believe, Sister Anne said, waving her hand dismissively. What the church needs is volunteers, people who are going to do it regardless of their religion. You volunteered, even though you do not believe in the human god? Sandry asked, surprised. He was curious now to see what the Sister Anne had to say, as he had always been told that the first responders only did this to glorify and worship their god while picking over the corpses of the dead. The idea that many of them were not even religious came as a shock. She laughed. I did, she said with a smile. I volunteered just like all my brothers and sisters here on the ship. Most of us are believers, but, she winked conspiratorially, not all of us. Do you not believe in the god? Sandry asked, the confusion on his face evident. No, not at first, Sister Anne said with a sad smile. But the longer I was out here, and the larger our wall of honored dead got, the more she paused and pursed her lips, turning away from the Sandry, searching for the right thing to say. Finally, she shrugged slightly and turned back. The more it felt right to say a quick prayer of thanks, or for protection, or even to light a candle in memory. You were infected, Sandry said fatly, as he stared at Sister Anne in disbelief. I suppose I was, she said, chuckling quietly. But it has brought me peace, a tranquility, out here in the void. She waved her hand to indicate the area outside the ship, where there are infrequently no gods, only monsters. But certainly, you stay on for your god, or at least the money, right? Sandry said, the question coming out more like a statement than he had intended. No, Sister Anne said, shaking her head gently. I stay on because it is the right thing to do. You, Sandry hesitated, confused. You sacrificed people just because it was the right thing to do, not for money or fame, he asked, a tinge of desperation creeping into his voice. I saw your people die. I saw you carried no plunder. You are not going to demand my government repay you for your losses. Sister Anne looked at him sadly, her eyes expressing deep hurt. No, we will not. The lives we lost are, she paused, seemingly searching for the right words, regrettable, but their families will be compensated by the church. She looked away and wiped her face for a moment with one hand. We will honor them, of course, nor will we forget them, but we do not do this for the money, as so many others do. But, said Sandry, his voice catching, I am the one responsible for the deaths. I called in the request. Willingly, Sister Anne said, turning back to Sandry, one eyebrow raised in suspicion. No, of course not, Sandry said quickly, taking his turn to be hurt. Sister Anne shrugged. Then you are blameless. She smiled again warmly. We cannot be held responsible for the things we do when fighting for our lives. Even Peter denied him. She reached out her hand and gently placed it on his shoulder. Not all of us are called to be martyrs. But, Sandry began, but Sister Anne made a shushing noise. You have had a very trying few days, and you are very injured, she said, as she stood up to lean over him and tuck him back into bed. You saw many of your friends die, several strangers die, and were held captive. It's all right to be overwhelmed. Sandry felt his jaw start to quiver, and his hands start to shake as he clutched desperately at Sister Anne's hands before she pulled them away again. But, he said as his voice shook, what do I do now? Sister Anne stared at him for a moment before straightening and reaching into her pocket. From it she produced a small silver chain with an oval of similar metal on it. She handed it to Sandry, who saw that the visage of a human was carved into it with a ring around its head. This, Sister Anne said, holding up the charm, is Saint Jude, patron of the desperate. She handed it over to Sandry, who took it gingerly, turning it over and around in his hands to examine it. She then reached out and took his hands in her own and smiled. Father Philip will be stopping by in a bit. He's better at comforting and helping survivors than I. She then closed his hands back around the charm. But until then, ask St. Jude for guidance, if you wish. He has brought me peace during many trying times. She then patted his shoulder again and walked out, dimming the lights behind herself. Sandry sat there for a long time, oblivious to its passage. He examined the image in his hands as he recounted the events of the last few days. The death, the blood, and the pleading from the last few days played out again and again before his eyes, and he felt himself becoming overwhelmed. Not just that it happened, but that these people, who so many reviled, willingly sacrificed their own lives and medicine so that he could return to his own. They bore the hatred of dozens of races when all they were trying to do was help. Perhaps, he whispered, as he stared at the charm before clasping it in his hands. He closed his eyes and held it tightly. Jude! Saint Jude. I don't really know how to ask this, but... he sighed, his breath in a moment, and let out a shaky breath. I could really use some help. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Bushmaster 177, Lord Ashrakal, Ambrose Cattell, Quantum Wednesday, Drugzoon WRE, and Blueberry Cat. Thank you very much for the support. It is super appreciated.